To everybody, and thank you so much for joining us from wherever you might be. As Heather said, it is really wonderful to see so many familiar faces on Zoom, and this was one of the reasons why we did not opt for a sort of straightforward webinar format, but rather a meeting so that we could try to see as many of you as we can, and it really is so nice to see familiar faces. So very much welcome, everybody. This is the latest webinar in the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, the global series that we have. As some of you may know, my name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I am the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, which is hosted at the University of Birmingham. And just briefly, for those of you who may not be as familiar with the community of practice, briefly to say, we are a diverse and ever-growing global network of practitioners and researchers in development and global affairs, committed to promoting more effective policy and practice. Our network includes all sorts of people with extensive experience working in or with the research community, civil society organizations, donor agencies, and implementing partners. And our webinar series seeks to convene conversations that address leading questions and debates related to thinking and working politically, in collaboration with different partners and with support from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. The Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice has turned 10 this year, and I am especially thrilled to be chairing this roundtable in conversation with Heather Marquette, Laure Hélène Piron, and Verena Fritz. These are three women who are not only veterans in the Thinking and Working Politically space, but they have been also colleagues of mine on all sorts of different projects and ventures over the years. And perhaps most importantly, they are very close friends. Just briefly to introduce them, Heather is professor of development politics at the University of Birmingham, where she leads the Serious Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Evidence, or SOC-ACE research program, which is also funded by FCDO. Heather is seconded part-time to FCDO's Research and Evidence Directorate as a Senior Research Fellow in Governance and Conflict, and she's an expert member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime Expert Network. I should also say that she's one of the founding members of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, which started life back in 2013 in a hotel in India. Laure Hélène is the director of the policy practice, and she has an illustrious career spanning 3 decades, working with organizations including ODI, and also what was then DFID and now FCDO, where she was a senior governance advisor and was also team leader in Afghanistan. And Laure Hélène has also been very active with the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, and she's in our steering committee. And last but not least, Verena is senior public sector specialist with the World Bank Group's governance global practice, and is currently working in a new global unit focused on public institutions and emerging themes such as climate change. Verena also has a long trajectory of work, including at the World Bank, where she has worked both on policy issues, but also at the regional and country levels. And she has been one of the leading proponents of political economy analysis within the bank. Throughout their work in and with these different organizations and partners, Heather, Laure Hélène, and Verena have all led and supported a variety of efforts to develop a deeper understanding of why things work the way that they do, whether it's about serious organized crime and corruption, or about democracy and human rights, or the public sector. And they have really tried to understand how change happens and what this implies for more effective policy and practice to tackle pressing global challenges and to foster reform. Today, we will be discussing what some of the most significant innovations around thinking in more politically aware ways and working differently as a result have been over the past decade, what insights and lessons have emerged for them along the way, and where they see this agenda getting traction and making a difference, and where it might head next. So let me briefly walk you through the structure of the roundtable so that you have a sense of what is coming. I will start with an individual question for Laure Hélène, Heather, and Verena in turn, and they will each have 5 minutes to address their specific question. while I will also invite the other two to comment, add, or otherwise engage with the other two questions. We will then open it up for a first round of questions and discussion with all of you in the audience. And after that, I will turn back to our roundtable guests for a further round of questions. We should then have some time left for an additional set of questions and comments from all of you in the audience before we wrap up with the final roundtable reflections or takeaways from the discussions. Okay, before we kick off, I just need to flag a couple of things, including the fact that this meeting is being recorded and that we will be posting the proceedings on the Thinking and Working Politically Community and Practice website. And also, part of the reason why we wanted to convene this, again, not so much as a straightforward webinar, but as a meeting, is to enable all of you to participate as actively as possible and to engage in the discussion, especially during the Q&A session or sessions. So you will have a couple of options to join the conversation and ask questions or what have you. So you can either raise your hand and ask a question directly, and we will ask if you do speak up, if you can please let us know who you are, give us your name briefly and your institutional affiliation, or you can also write in the chat and we'll be monitoring that. So that is how this will work. And I see now there's a lot of activity already on the chat, which is great. So let me, without further ado, let me start with our roundtable conversation. And let me turn first to Laure Hélène with the question that I have for her, which is a big picture question to help us frame where we are. So Laure Hélène, thinking back to where thinking and working politically debates and discussions were at a decade ago, what do you think some of the most significant contributions or innovations in this space have been since then?
Thanks, Alina. And just to frame what I'll be saying, 10 years ago, I was still working in DFID and I was working on public sector governance issues. And through the work we were doing, we just realized the only way to move forward with this agenda, which wasn't very popular in DFID in those days, was actually to think and work politically and to really look at the political barriers to reform in the sector that tended to be dominated by specialists. So 10 years ago, this resonated with us in a very sort of specific sector. And of course, then I did a review of how DFID was working on this agenda, using or not using political economy analysis. And I'll start by saying that my view is sort of glass half full. I'm going to highlight what I think has gone well over the last 10 years, because there's a tendency to be a bit skeptical and see everything that we haven't yet achieved. But I think we should really feel that there's been a real traction of this approach. And the key indicator for me would be the number of guidance documents that have been developed by donor agencies, but also NGOs and think tanks and companies on this agenda, and especially agencies updating their guidance. So of course, you, Alina, updated the work done with Diana Kamak before with USAID, and we've got on the call, I've spotted John Rose and David Jacobstein. So USAID updated its guide in 2018. Last year, I was working with the Australian government, DFAT, on their own guidance that they want to be updated. Over the last year, we worked together, Alina, with Alan Waits and Graham Teskey and others to update FCDO's own guidance. So the British government's merged Department for Development and Diplomacy decided it needed to have its own approach to political economy analysis and make this well known across the organization. And we also have sort of thematic guidance being developed, say, by the World Resources Institute on climate change and governance, or by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy on democracy issues. So I think there's been this massive uptake, and organizations developing their own approaches, their own guidance, just shows there's demand for management and by staff to have clarity on what this means for them. So that's my first sort of big picture highlight. The main innovation, I would say, is the diversity of the way in which political economy analysis is done, which reflects the needs of the different organizations so that it feeds into their decision-making process and eventually their results and their impact. So we're really seeing much more operational studies that try to make more specific recommendations. Of course, we still have what I would call landscape studies covering a country or sector, and they can be really useful for people that are new into a country or an organization just engaged in the sector to begin with. But what's been great is to have much more focused studies. So I'm sure Heather or Verena will say much more about problem-based approaches, because Verena, you wrote a book about this a long time ago. So I won't highlight the problem-based approach, but there's a diversity of studies, and we highlight that in the new FCDO guide. So for example, the fact that you can do an analysis just within your own team through a conversation, through a range of interviews that are well selected, but it doesn't have to be a long study that's really expensive and takes a really long time. Studies that are done in response to specific events or specific needs or specific developments. So the flexibilities that some organizations have been able to generate for their own programs. So that goes to the whole issue of adaptive management, which I'm sure we'll turn into, but the fact that organizations have moved from having their own guidance, but also try to improve their system and processes, which of course is still a barrier, which we'll discuss later on. But still, we have much more flexibility from organizations, and programs are able to be more creative if people now know how to play by the rules and sort of go around the rules. I also think there's been improvements and innovations in the content of the PA themselves. So there is still consensus on the core PA concept, sort of the importance of institutions, informal institutions, interests, incentives. So those features that are not always taken into account by traditional development programs. So that's there. There's a question mark to my mind about the role of stakeholder mapping and whether there's too much emphasis on analyzing stakeholders and not enough reflecting on what's driving the behavior and motivation of stakeholders. That's another point to discuss. But there's consensus on that point. But the content of PS have been able to evolve in response to criticism. So 10 years ago, I remember clearly, there was a critique that PS were not gender sensitive and were completely gender blind and did not take inclusion into account. Well, the committee has responded. There's been great sort of guidance and studies done by the Gender Development Network, for example, or the Development Leadership Program. And now it's taking a standard that you have to think about inclusion issues whenever you do PA and assess to what extent that's relevant or not. So I would highlight sort of those diversity of approaches, the ability of the frameworks and the tools to adjust to sort of new insight and what's needed. And the final point, which is maybe a little bit more controversial, and I would love to hear from everyone in the room, your own experiences, is moving from PA and thinking working politically being about donor programs to actually being a mindset in which you operate. And what I've picked up through the course we've been delivering with ODI and the policy practice, and we've got David Booth on the call, and David, you were one of the first trainers, started in 2008. The course we've been delivering is still going really strongly. We've got 90% participants this year. So it shows there's an appetite out there to think and work politically, to know what the methodology is, to be able to apply it to a range of sectors. And it doesn't have to be just a donor agency or an implementer. It's amazing to see the participants, people that work for NGOs, think tanks, they want to drive their own reform processes, and they think PA is a way in which they can drive their own change. So I'll stop here, and I would love to hear what Verena and Heather want to add.
Thank you, Lauren. And that's actually very comprehensive and also a lot of great material packed in 5 minutes. So that's brilliant. Yes, can I please invite Heather and Verena to come in? One thing that might be good as part of this big picture question, and I don't know if either of you want to touch on it, but I'm wondering, is there something that is indispensable about political economy analysis that cannot be done through other kinds of analysis, and what that might be? And Heather in particular has written about, well, a lot of people here also, but Heather has written about the soup of acronyms that have cropped up over the past 10 years. And she did a wonderful write-up for Duncan Green's blog, From Poverty to Power, some time ago, about what we miss out when we miss the T in TWP. So maybe if you can comment on that as well, that would be fantastic. So over to you, Heather, and then Verena. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Laure Hélène, as well. I was going to start with actually the point that Laure Hélène made about, Verena being here and David Booth being here as well. And this idea about sort of thinking about being more problem driven rather than solutions led. And to me, this is probably, if I were going to say, other than the overarching, which, you find it hard to believe that it's actually a thing that you still need to say that politics actually matters, that being probably the most important insight over the last, well beyond a decade. But for me, the problem-driven one is the most important one for me. I think that, we all know that there's a huge demand in a field where you never know all the right answers or the way to do things, where the challenges are always complex, the money is never enough, the time is never enough, and so on. And there's going to be a huge demand for things like best practice, toolkits, menus of tactics and approaches, and so on, for people who are trying to do the best work to bring about the change that they want. To me, this isn't a donor thing. This is a bureaucracy thing. So some of the biggest appetite for toolkits can come from government ministries wherever in the world. And as experts, we do quite like writing toolkits, even if we don't call them that as well, because you're trying to distill your expertise. So there's real incentives there to do things. Focusing on the actual underlying problem is far harder in reality than you might think. But it's really important. And I think if you're taking political economy analysis, if you're using PEA to apply to the wrong thing, then you'll have a nice kind of sense of what the context and everything is, but you're still not going to do it well. And I wanted to give one example relatively recently from a conversation I had that was different to the ones I was having 10 years ago. And I was talking to a group in a country where there was an attempt to build a stronger bilateral partnership between countries that needed to share intelligence better in order to tackle particular problems around organized crime. And one country was really struggling because the other country just did not have the kind of data protection laws and systems in place in order to be able to sign that agreement. And the people I was talking to kept saying, well, there isn't political will to do this. There's a lack of political will. And so we actually stepped back and said, right, let's try to do a really quickie sort of version of problem-driven PEA and start to unpack things. And where we ended up with was that the country that was really not that interested in prioritizing this was one where until relatively recently, there was a really powerful secret police. So it's a country where there is no concept of privacy to match the other one because most adults have never experienced privacy in the same sort of way. So on the long list of priorities for this government, this was just not their biggest priority. If you're not thinking about a problem-driven approach, what you end up with in that situation is either the one side of the table keeps banging their head against the same door, getting nowhere, or they give up and they go, well, there's a lack of political will, it's probably corruption or whatever it is. Or they step back to say, okay, they don't value this intrinsically, but they want something else. So how do we work with them, compromise, offer ways to do things in order to help them understand what they're going to get by prioritizing something that isn't a priority for them? And it's still ongoing. I don't know if the process will work, but it was a completely different thing to do. You could do that with PEA, but if the PEA was focused on a solution that's just not going to work in that context, it wouldn't get you anywhere as well. And I think with that, I will stop and hand over to Verena.
Yes, please, Verena, can we hear from you as well?
Great, thank you so much. And so it's really, really nice to see everyone. And thanks again to Alina and Catherine for organizing this session. And maybe also just to say that I'm speaking in my personal and expert capacity or not with an official position of the World Bank. But let me start from there. So I think I agree with many of the points that Laure Hélène and Heather made. From what I see, and to some extent, right, working with a large development organization, you become a bit insular within that organization. But there's a broadening interest, I think, across different regions, even in regions. For us, there was a heavy footprint of political economy work initially more in the Africa region, and we really see an expansion of that interest. So the region that I most recently worked on in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, clearly there is a far more attention than there used to be. And I think that's also the case for other regions, partially because we see that the world has become so much more complex. And that, some of the optimism perhaps about easy ways to improve governance also have not been quite materializing. And I think, so that's an important, so this acceptance and interest in a wider range of countries. And then of course, the key two perhaps other key elements of the problem driven for me seems by now so natural, so ingrained that sometimes I even forget addressing or speaking about that specifically, but it's something that bears repeating, especially when I'm talking with sector teams, for example, that have never done this type of work before, right? They try to do a big landscape study and you have to try and figure out, well, what is more specific here? But generally, I think we've seen a broadening over time across many more countries and more sectors and more specific issues. And one that I will speak more about later on is also, of course, climate change, the expansion of renewables and what's holding that back. So there's new topics, but this, and that really builds understanding of certain patterns that sometimes are, repeat across a region, or you see them in the energy sector in different countries. And I think that enables us to do some of this work in a more focused, in a faster and more agile way. So that's important as well. And then there is some questions or some lesson learning, I think, in building around how do we evidence this well, right? We are a very data-driven, evidence-driven organization. What is a credible level of evidencing and how do we go about this? That's still somewhat unsettled, I would say, but it's somewhere we have learned and gained important experience over the last decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Verena. Thank you, Laure Hélène, and thank you, Heather. I will now move to the next question, which I would address to Heather first. And some of this already has emerged a little bit, but Heather, for you, what are the two most important lessons or insights that have emerged along your own TWP journey, both in terms of how you think and how you work?
Okay, thanks, Alina. I'd actually only sort of really had one, so we'll see how it goes. But actually, I was just replying in the chat for a second to something that Demir said, and what I'm going to say relates directly to that. For me, in my experience, I come back to a blog that Alina wrote ages ago called Parlez-vous Politics. And in it, Alina talked about how, there's some people, and you don't have to be a political scientist to begin to think about politics, but there are some people who just really seem to get these ideas and concepts, and then people who really struggle with them, and they might not have the training or the experience or so on, but can pick it up quite quickly, or they might really need to have it sort of translated in a very different way. I wrote a response to that as well, and it's actually something that David Hudson and I wrote about in a chapter for, there's an OECD volume about thinking, working politically that Alan Waits and Graham and others organized, and a bunch of us contributed to. And in that, David and I talked about how one of the problems, as we saw it with PEA at the time, was the insistence on using certain frameworks and certain concepts that actually just don't resonate. And there are all sorts of ways that you can think about these things as well. Since then, I've gone on to really try to think about the people that I'm speaking to, what it is they're grappling with, what they actually care about, and the language that is going to resonate with them. And I actually use really different language in different meetings and different audiences, depending on who's there. I worked with colleagues in FCDO, and then also working with policy practice colleagues as well, testing out certain ideas around how you think about thinking, working politically when it comes to people who are tasked with tackling organized crime. I mean, these are people coming from law enforcement, military, civil society, development, diplomacy, I mean, huge in the private sector and so on. Everybody thinks completely differently and uses different sorts of language. And we did 3 or 4 training sessions where each time we'd test different language. We'd listen to whoever was kicking us off, whether it was a regional lead or an ambassador or something, to see how he or she framed it in order to get people at the table, and just really paid attention to that. And it's something in the new research program that Alina mentioned that I'm leading, called SawCase, where a big part of it is about trying to think about that language. And poor Alina's been one of the people who's written a paper for us, work kind of giving red pen, going, well, actually, this will work for an ex-DFID audience. It's not going to work for a military or a law enforcement. Could we tweak it a little bit there as well? Do actually have a research project on this, and I can share an output for it. But what we look at in this first paper is this idea that actually the framing is really important. If you want people to think and work politically, you can't keep using the same language that you use for one audience with different ones, and actually learning about the different ways that people frame things, the way they approach problems, what their motivations are, All of that is fundamental if you want to get traction on it. And it will probably mean doing something very different to what you planned on doing in the first place. And I can share the link there. Demir asked about speaking to engineers and different audiences as well. And what I found is there is a book, a fantastic book by somebody called Carmen Malena called From Political Won't to Political Will. And she wrote it about 15 years ago. And in it, what she talked about, there was a series of case studies for different programs or approaches to reforms where they achieved against the odds. And she came up with this idea of political will actually being a combination of political want, political can, and political must. And so really thinking about, do you have evidence that whoever it is that needs to change, that they really want to, do they have the can, the capacity, the resources, and so on? And is there something really compelling them? That seems to resonate with, so not just the sorts of people I'm engaging with right now, but sector people as well. I mean, huge range, kind of, they get political will because everybody talks about it, but they get this approach as well. And they also like how it's a really good way to see if somebody is window dressing. So somebody might say all the right things, but if they're not putting the right resources or skills or so on into it, then they might just be telling you what you want to hear in order to get something they want. So that comes through really strongly from there as well. I have the real pleasure of seeing that approach resonate with a really diverse range of actors who get in touch to say, this has actually helped us to unlock this process, or we're getting change here. I'm sitting in a city with someone who's a former law enforcement official, and he just shrugging and saying, it's just thinking, working politically. I mean, how hard is it? And I thought, God, you have no idea how hard the last 10 years have been trying to tell people about this and shift that, and what an absolute joy it was. And he just gave a talk in a country for the UNODC last week, where he framed the entire thing around thinking, working politically for regional law enforcement officers, and it absolutely has made my day, to say the least. So for me on my journey, that's been a big part of it. And the one thing I would say with that, and I think this comes through a bit in the paper that David and I wrote, is that the thing that I keep hearing from people is I will sometimes get introduced as, she's not a typical tree hugger, she's not a typical development person, or something like that. And people will say, I really liked that you understood the problems that we face. I really liked that you treated us with respect, and you didn't come in and preach or tell us how we're doing our jobs wrong, or something like that. And I think that has taken a long time of a lot of listening and reading and so on to get to that point. But it really strikes me how important that is if you're trying to talk about this to people who aren't familiar with things, but really are interested in change. So
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much, Heather. I will have to stop you now because we need to turn hopefully to Verena and Laure Hélène as well, who can share one lesson each if you might, rather than two. That would be really great. Thank you. Verena, over to you.
Thank you. Oh, this is hard. So the first point really is that I am convinced that political economy responds to a really felt problem, right? So lots of people, whether in the more security apparatus or in the development world, they feel they're trying to make something happen, and it's hard and it doesn't easily happen. And so that's where, and the issues that they run into are grounded in political economy almost always. Now, on the working, just to say two things. One is, how do I work, right? When I actually do direct work in country. So, that's always thinking about what are the incentives, and to take them seriously, and then to kind of depart from there. And the other part of my working is to advise others, right? How could they work differently? So that's a lot of work that also I think many in the audience are doing, to advise others. And then it's partially to say, look at these incentives. And then once you've identified the challenges, right? Maybe there isn't a political want or can or must. Some of that may be missing. Then define, what do you do, right? How do you deal with that? Do you adapt to that space? Do you try to change or influence that space? But don't easily assume the degree of change that you can influence, be realistic, but also don't think that things are static. They are dynamic. So there's often some opportunities. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Verena. That's great. Laure Hélène, over to you.
Yeah, I think what I'll also resonate with both what Heather and Verena have said is when I started this work, I assumed I'd be just doing studies, different reports, traveling around the world and be lucky enough to be able to interview people and get a good sense of what was going on. But clearly this type of work is all about facilitating processes. The way Verena described it, facilitating people you work with, understanding of their context and how they can actually then reach a solution they want to get to in a way that's realistic. And to do that, you need to both understand what might be potential barriers to guide the conversation by getting them to ask the right questions. We always say in the different documents we write, ask the why questions, go under the surface of things, explore more deeply what the barriers are, even if they're really uncomfortable to you, or even if they're really obvious because you know that this politician is corrupt, or you know that the society is more gender discriminatory than others, or has sort of certain types of racism would be really embedded. But just pushing people to ask those questions more deeply. And you need to have the skills of facilitating those discussions. So it's that kind of a role of a PA accompaniment process, and making sure when you come in and you support the process, making sure you leave something behind. So always embedding in the organization's own systems or in the project structure, ways in which they'll be doing this on an ongoing basis. And I see we've got, for example, Stephen Fraser on the call, who's been doing all this great work in Nigeria, really getting their own programs, their UK-funded programs on public sector governance and sort of advocacy to actually do that more systematically. So I would say that's the main lesson for me, is always think about people you're working with and help them ask questions and help them improve the work that they're doing. Thanks, Alina.
Fantastic, Laure Hélène. Thank you. And thanks to Heather and Verena as well. Just to round off the last question that I wanted to ask, and this now goes to Verena. Verena, where do you think the TWP agenda might head next?
Great, thanks. So I think I currently perceive, and it's aligned with what Laure Hélène, I think, said it for the first question, a renewed level of interest. And I think that's partially related to the fact that the going is getting a little harder. There is a bit of more concern about global trends in the right direction, a sense of deteriorating stability in a number of countries and regions. And I think that really reinforces the interest in understanding these kinds of drivers and how we can deal with them and address them. So that's, of course, doesn't make our job easier, right? It's harder to get positive change when it's a more challenging situation. The second key point, I think, really is about the growing attention to climate change and the different facets of climate change, mitigation, the rapid transitions that will be required for that, the issue that we need to do things under time pressure on a large scale. And I think that's naturally then leads to the question, well, okay, what are the political economy obstacles to making change happen fast and difficult change happen fast, and change that will involve quite a lot of losers and then some potential winners fast? And then how do we deal with some of the fallout of negative impacts with climate adaptation needs and the competition between different groups and so on? So I think that's clearly also a very big part of the coming agenda for the coming years, and some renewed interest. I think that, and then we have, as Laure Hélène set out, the frameworks and some of that being updated, which is great. I think the last point that's still a bit the gap, and it's a difficult gap, is for development agencies to bring this more into their DNA of, if you want, the standard operating procedures, to focus a little bit less on logical frameworks and a little bit more as to what is the real world out there and how is change likely to happen in that world, and how are, what are the dynamics around incentives, and then how do our technical interventions interact with that difficult and messy and sometimes problematic real world? How do we deal with the fact that elites may not have the best interest of citizens in mind, but we still need to work with them and through them and use some of the incentives that they have to make some positive change happen, to get then to the next level and try to move to further good things. So I think that getting it from growing interest somewhat more deeply into the DNA without it becoming a box ticking exercise. So that's the other big risk, right? If it just becomes box ticking, it's too complex, it's too important to kind of land in that space. That will be, that would entail a lot of risks as well as benefit. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verena, for that. And before I turn to Laure Hélène and Heather for their reflections on this question, let me just ask you, because obviously you've been at the bank in several different capacities, wearing very different hats, and raise this question about whether or not the standard operating procedures of organizations such as the World Bank are fit for purpose. Have you seen important changes in the ways that the bank tries to work? And how have you felt about the possibility that you have to think and work politically while you were doing your more region-focused work?
It's a great question. So I think on the one hand, we do see questions about political economy and incentives coming up in more and more of our review meetings. And again, let me just emphasize that I'm speaking in my expert capacity and not kind of on behalf of the bank. But that's the positive part. But then there is always a lot of other bureaucratic elements that are more dominant and that distract sometimes more focused and deeper attention. Okay, so what does this concretely mean? How do we deal with risk? And the other is perhaps still a tendency to say, well, there are risks, or we just mitigate them, rather than having a more frank and honest discussion about risks and how we take them on, and is that a good idea, and how do we deal with them if scenario A or scenario B arises, which can, right? We don't know the pathways beforehand. So I think there could still be quite a few things to do, and if we ever being asked to do them, I think we have some ideas of how to set that out. I think perhaps we are at a point where there is more experience and knowledge to contribute in a meaningful way. But those are some of the issues I would outline.
Excellent. Laure Hélène, can I invite you to reflect on where next?
So I think ideally where next is a just more systematic approach. So I was glass half full at the beginning, glass half empty that this is still at times too ad hoc. Despite this more enabling environment in terms of some of the rhetoric and some of the guidance and procedures, we are seeing pockets of interesting practice and innovation, but also often barriers that we've started to touch upon. So I would like to see how that could be done more systematically. And I find there's this sort of growing body of evidence over the last 15 years or so. And everyone on this call seems to be involved in either generating the evidence or writing it up. So we've got growing evidence, but the evidence needs to show to senior managers, to decision makers, why this approach is going to help them do their job. And it's time consuming, it's expensive, especially if you do large research. It's really uncomfortable when the findings tell you not to invest in the country, not to engage with a stakeholder you really wanted to work with. So it's uncomfortable for decision makers, and we just have to show them why this would actually, at the end of the day, help them achieve their objectives. So for me in the future, there's still more work to be done, convincing decision makers through evidence that's targeted at different organizations. So generating that individually for each organization. In addition to having champions that keep demonstrating why that's feasible. It could be within USAID, DFID, it could be within specific more sort of sectoral organizations as well. And we all know, and a lot of you on this call are champions for that approach. So for me, that's the critical barrier, Alina, sort of how do we move to that more systematic approach?
Thank you, Laure Hélène. And last but not least, Heather, your reflections on this, please.
Thanks. I'm just going to build off of the comment that David put in the chat and that Laure Hélène just referred to. So thinking about the extent that, how did donors study how change happened in the world? and so on. I think firstly, I mean, one thing, David, I'm going to pick on you, but I know this isn't what you meant, but I think moving away from talking about donors is really important as well. So it's not a homogenous category, but within organizations, within sectors, all of this. So these are very different than their individuals, but sectors are very different as well. And some sectors, they don't sit on their own within a donor as well. They sit within a huge kind of ecosystem, and some sectors are just more technical than others. Some lend themselves really easily to political thinking, and some don't as well. Laure Hélène flagged research, and you actually took sort of, one thing I was going to say is that research is also like that. So if most of the research that you read outside project evaluations and so on in country is deeply technical and apolitical, then that will shape how you think about things as well. So it's a much bigger sort of thing than just donors in that kind of sense. So in my experience, people do read much more widely than I think they're given credit for, but it depends on what is being published, what's being done within that field as well. And sometimes it can be a bit more challenging as well. I'm going to say something that I think will probably cause deep sort of intake of breath from panelists as well as others, but I also really think that one of the challenges for us is being much more realistic about how donors and aid is ever going to change. And partly that's because these are bureaucracies. Bureaucracies absolutely have to have rules, standard operating procedures, and so on. They need that for accountability, as well as managing large budgets, complex projects, and all of that kind of thing. There's a limit to the sorts of things that they're able to do and to adapt. But adaptation is actually really difficult. And you can see the stuff that I've been reading recently, but I've got books downstairs that I've been reading this week around military adaptation and how difficult it is within organizations that are hierarchical and have to be hierarchical for decision making to actually adapt, and some of the consequences of that, and then where you do see successful adaptation happening as well. I think civil society can also be just as challenging sometimes as donors in the room as well, because a lot of the sort of things that Laure Hélène, you were just describing around kind of things like compromises that you have to make and difficult findings, civil society can also struggle with those. They may find it unethical or immoral to try to make those compromises. And I find, as a research director, some of the most challenging outputs when I'm reviewing them are when I kind of take a red pen to recommendations to say, this is actually never going to happen in real life. Even though you felt good writing it, we don't want research outputs that aren't politically feasible. That's the entire point. You have to do some of this legwork for your readers there as well. And with that, I mean, to me, I started really trying to think about focusing on really what for me are the most important things that I'd like to see it to change. And the thing I keep coming back to, I've written about this on Duncan Green's blog or so on, it was from a TWP community practice meeting about conflict ages ago. And I won't use the exact wording because we're recording and so on, but there was a diplomat in the room who said for him at the heart of it, TWP is about not screwing stuff up. If we screw less stuff up by making sure that we understand the context and that we adapt in order to do that, that is a real win. So that's the first thing I'm always thinking about is unintended consequences, the tensions and trade-offs, and not screwing stuff up as well. And also, I think applying that TWP lens back to what we're doing. So try not to fight losing battles as well. I think on the PEA front, discovered a whole world of sort of literature out there on the military side about politics and political settlements. UK Army manuals from the early 2000s talk about political settlements and legitimacy and what do we do. There's the PMESI, that's a sort of US Army political economy analysis framework that talks about politics as the very first thing. And there's things in there about adaptation and legitimacy and all of that as well. And what that just drives home is how really difficult it is to do that. And Verena started us out by talking about all of these big challenges that require a lot of compromise and collective action and sort of shared understanding. And that's only going to happen if we have more adaptive ways of working and can be flexible. But I think that for me, it's trying to think about how you do that within the real world that I'm working in, not necessarily the one that I would like to see as well. And for me, the easiest way to do that is to apply it back to my own country of origin or my country of residency as well. So if anybody knows how to get elites to do the difficult things and to make the hard choices to tackle those big things here, it's really difficult to see sometimes. So why would we expect it to be any easier elsewhere as well? And that's the thing that I keep trying to come back to in my mind in order to be as realistic as possible going forward.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you so much, Verena and Laure Hélène, also for all your wonderful inputs into this conversation. As we said earlier, we really are so excited to see so many of you who have been fellow travelers on this road for many, many years. And so we would very much want to invite you to ask questions. I see we have several Stephanie Molinas online, but I recognize one who's does not. So I think that's Sarah Swift from USA. That's great. But yes, if you have questions, please raise your hand if you can, because that would be the nicest way to do that. Or if not, then you can put them in the chat, please. So I don't know. I think we don't have. Oh, there's Leila. Okay, I see Leila. Okay, Leila, we start with you, and then maybe we go from there. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm Leila Kazemi. I work specifically on extractives governance and have been looking at this at a kind of field-wide level for the extractives governance field, but also working with individual organizations as they try to internalize some of these ideas. And I think that one of the kind of big innovations that, or set of innovations that seem kind of obvious to me as an observer of what you all have been up to and deeply appreciative of what has been coming out of TWP has been in the last few years, the kind of additional constellation of factors and ways of working that are kind of brought into thinking and working politically, and whether that is about being more sort of the adaptive management stuff, but it also just being more locally led, being more learning centric for all of this, dealing with complex systems and understanding, you know, a lot of the governance. If you're working on extractives governance, you're working on complex systems issues. And as we work with individual organizations to try to integrate all of these pieces, I think it can be really overwhelming, both as the person who is facilitating it and trying to kind of make it manageable, but also for the recipients. And it underscores for me how much there is to try to bring in, but also how much facilitation is required for that. And it really needs like a sort of, it moves way beyond any documents or resources that you can provide, and seems to require a lot of handholding. But I was wondering, I mean, do you all see that practically speaking in your work? Are you trying to sort of bring these other pieces in, understanding, you know, why change happens and how change happens? And because at some point, you know, the variables start to feel like they are infinitely proliferating. And I'm wondering how you guys have been dealing with that. And if you've been trying to kind of keep a closer line around what TWP means. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leila, for that. I thought we had Julie Smolnici raising her hand, but I'm not sure that she has her hand up anymore. So yes, now she's appeared.
Yes, I have, but maybe you want to answer first to Leila.
I think we can do a round, and then okay. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, well, very briefly for me, it's also a reaction to Laure Hélène when she mentioned mindset. And I'm struggling a little bit in my work with the interpretation of, you know, we talk about analysis, about approach, about mindset, and I'm at the moment writing a short piece for the Swiss Development Agency on what
Julie, I think we may have lost you. Do you want to write your question on
PA would mean for the what sector? It's just supporting a bit the practitioners. That they review to look at the documents, and is it an approach? And when I mentioned everyday political analysis or political approach, PA, they said, please don't do that. That's not a yoga. We are not talking about yoga practice. And people are really struggling with that. And for me, that would be key to, that's really should be a mindset. And I don't see a problem. We need to be more flexible, and people are so much into, it has to be either this or that. And I think for me, that's a bit of struggle to have people understanding what is it. It's just they want to have one definition, whereas it's a multiple of things. So I'm struggling with that, and I would like to have your advices a bit on that, how we call that, how do we call it in the end, that's one thing. And the other thing is, I feel, and that's again linked to my practice and my experience, I feel that, if in the end it's about processes and facilitation, we need to speak more in a practical way. So academic research, that's fine, but in the end, political science specialists, they use a lot of wording that people don't understand, and they can't grasp political settlement and a lot of other things. And that's the struggle. Can you work on those topics without knowing and understanding and talking about those words? And that's maybe also referring to what Heather was mentioning before about the way you have, adapting the speech that you have. But that's a bit of the question. Do you feel also that there is a need to be a bit more practical and avoid even politics for people that are outside? They don't know what it means, and they ask me in that document, they ask me, please define. So that's also showing a bit the level. I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much for both those questions. I don't think we have any further ones, so maybe I can turn to the roundtable guests to address them. Just briefly, I think this question of language really does matter quite a lot, and it has come up. And to give you a sense of what's coming from the community practice, we have a paper that is being written by someone who works for a large NGO, CAFOD, who will be sharing her experiences trying to translate what for many seems like a very academic and abstract way of thinking into something that is much more accessible for people in their everyday realities. So without further ado, I don't know who from the three of you, Heather, Laure Hélène, or Verena, would want to tackle the questions and start. Thank you.
I can come in on the first point, Leila, and it's a pleasure to see you after all the few time we've been speaking. I would say to you, this is very complex, and when you do analysis, when you unpack problems, it can get really complicated. But the advice given by both Verena and Heather around focusing on a specific problem, and then you dig into that problem, you try to understand what's driving it, and you go into uncomfortable places, but eventually you try to bring everyone together around a shared understanding of what's causing that problem. I would say it's the first step to try to then set boundaries. But you need to sort of drop lines of inquiries along the way, but also be creative about letting people make proposals that you might not have thought about at the beginning, but keep that focus on what you're really trying to understand better. And then I think what's been improving over the years, and again, in the framework that we use at the policy practice and with other organizations, is always think about the operational implications as a full part of your PA. It's not an add-on. You're doing the analysis because you want to have useful recommendations and implications that are selected by those that are going to actually implement the program or design the strategy or design the foreign policy. So it's a process that they have to go through. And if you link the two together much more closely, I don't think we end up with something that's really unmanageable. And they will know for themselves what's feasible within their own bureaucracies. Heather mentioned that what's pretty feasible within a bureaucracy. Verena referred to what might be feasible or not within the World Bank. Those individuals know exactly what the room for maneuver is, and you can actually then challenge them to think a bit outside of the box. But I would highlight that point. And then on Julie's point, and it's great to also always have you ask for more and more practical advice, really. Something we haven't mentioned so far, but it's the importance, I think, of having multidisciplinary teams. Because yes, you have on your team a political scientist, you have someone, hopefully a water engineer, and you need to be able to foster dialogue between the two. And a good political scientist or a good development professional or a good PA expert is able to translate that language and make them understand what the barrier might be without, the political scientist will be using some big frameworks or theories, but should be able to translate that into questions or conversations that are accessible to other team members. And through that, the point I made earlier on, getting people to relate that to their day-to-day experiences. We've all experienced discrimination, corruption, unfair situations. So let's not pretend the world we work in when we do development programs is any different, or diplomacy. So I think often linking it to people's own experiences makes that really come to life. But I'll hand over to Heather or Verena for the other questions.
Verena, do you mind if I jump in?
Sure, go ahead.
Layla, you can see how I interpreted your question from my answer, what's on my mind, but focusing on what you said about sort of expanding or limiting what we're working on, and so on, and actually how much work the sorts of processes that Laure Hélène and others have described is kind of facilitating and supporting, and so on. And my answer is kind of yes and no. So I wouldn't say in any way I'm limiting what I'm doing or who I'm working with. I'm sort of massively expanding it, sort of, constantly reading new things and sort of engaging with new people, sort of one-on-one or in groups, and really, constantly learning and thinking as well. Really exciting. It comes at a big cost though. And from what I found is if you're useful, then word gets around. And then people want to quite rightly and understandably follow up as well with more questions. And so my emails are just out of control. Went to a conference in Washington in December where the entire thing was people either saying, I haven't seen you since before COVID and you've let your hair go gray, or I sent you an email and ... as well. And I do think that that's part of that. If you're in this space and you're trying to kind of work and support others, the demand is actually, from my experience, almost limitless. So you do have to be a bit careful. I would also say I am sort of changing and shaping a little bit as well. Part of this is what I said about not fighting pointless battles. To me, this isn't not fighting battles or giving up. If anybody knows me well enough, you know that I'm not kind of, going to step back from something where I think there's a chance of getting a change or challenging things. But I feel like for me in the aid programming space, I've kind of done what I've wanted to do and have contributed what I want to contribute. And I'm not sort of doing as much, I think, as I used to there, focusing on completely different work. And so that is part of that, I think, is, when you're changing, moving that on as well. I mean, with Julie, I wanted to say this point about language, I think is really important. And I don't know about other people here, but as a writer, I always have an audience in mind, a specific one. And usually if you're trying to write something that you think will support or persuade people, having the most difficult person you've ever encountered in your mind when you're writing it helps. I am absolutely not going to share who this is, but there's somebody who used to go to meetings and he would sort of a kind of World Bank, OECD type, and he would sit there in the corner with his arms crossed. And I thought, if I could get him, if I write to him and think about how to uncross his arms, that is going to really help. I used to joke with Graham Teskey that I was going to make a cardboard cutout of him and stick him in the corner of my office with what do I do differently on a Monday morning in there. And in what I'm working on now, I have a fantastic friend who works for law enforcement here in the UK, who is one of the grumpiest people I've ever met when it comes to development and anything like this. And I will test things and language past him. And if it gets a grunt of, yeah, I guess it's okay, I know that it's really, really going well. And the point you made about multidisciplinary teams is also really important. If you're only working with people who speak the same language as you, you get used to thinking that this is normal and it translates well, and it doesn't. I do have a really good friend who's ex-stabilization unit, and I send him instant messages all the time to say, what on earth was that language they just used? If I say this, is it going to sound really ridiculous? Things like that, and bit by bit you build that up. And finally, just to point to something in the chat, and Laure Hélène, you've flagged kind of David's work and that importance of sort of brokers who sit between research or evidence and practice. And I think that's also really important too, is working with people. If you're not used to writing in that way or sort of working that way, working with people who can help you translate that is also important, because not everybody can be great at every part of this process here in terms of that language and change as well.
Thank you so much, Heather. Verena, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Maybe just very briefly, very much seconding this point on the multi-sectoral teams and the need. Whenever I directly get involved in political economy analysis, I have to really learn the sectoral issues about, right? Whether it is, I recently worked on extractives, on the health, political economy issues in the health sector, in higher education. So thinking through what are the issues in that sector, finding a sector expert to talk to about what are the obstacles, what are understanding the stakeholder constellations, understanding how the institutions are structured and set up and financed. So that's really critical, and having that dialogue, I think, also helps using or, seeing what language would work. I think as much as we can, simply using common terms, but keeping in mind what we know about structures and political economy dynamics. I think that has often helped me to find a way to connect and to get points across, and then always asking back, right, what are the issues you're struggling with? How has that evolved? What have you tried that has not worked? And then thinking through, and I think that's always the other key issue is, and I think Laure Hélène spoke to this, what are the recommendations? What are the implications for actions that we draw? That's one of the hardest parts to do well and to get right. And then once we have those recommendations, what often is then another layer of challenge is to have the space and the time and the engagement to continue working with sectoral teams over a period of time. So Rachel is connected to this call. She's done this very deeply with some of our water management colleagues in the bank. So sometimes when we have a real sectoral program also for some of our energy team, fossil fuel subsidy reforms, that really itself says there's big challenges that we need to grapple with. And then it really becomes a deeper engagement over longer time, going from the more analytic side to practically, so, what do we do in this particular set of countries or country or region? And then what do we do here? And then also learning those lessons. So that's when it really kind of becomes granular, becomes ingrained, and develops a real impact and effectiveness on what we do. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all of you again. I sort of have the easier job because all I'm doing is asking very hard questions or not so hard questions to our wonderful guests. But I just want to reflect on something because it picks up on a few things that have come up in the conversation about something that Laure Hélène said about making sure that whatever we're doing is actually useful to those who have to use it. And I think for me, and also I think, Julie, you mentioned this sort of, if we think about political economy analysis as a mindset and thinking working politically as a compass rather than as a sort of product, right? So something that helps you navigate complex issues and territories, but does not really give you a straitjacketed answer. It's really important to make sure that people don't think about political economy analysis as yet another thing that is being imposed on them. Oh yeah, this is another framework that I now have to incorporate or integrate, and this is another requirement that I have to box tick, and I just cannot be bothered. And really sort of thinking about, well, based on what those people have to do and the kinds of questions that they have and the kinds of challenges that they're facing and the kinds of problems that they want to address, is there a way to internalize a politically aware lens to the sets of questions that they have to be asking, where perhaps they may not be thinking about this so obviously, rather than making it feel like it's another new thing completely and it's superimposed and juxtaposed. So briefly on that, I wanted to now go back to our guests, and I have one question for all of you, if I may, which is if you can discuss based on the sort of topics and issues that have arisen as part of this discussion that we're having. Can you think about some of the opportunities and challenges to give TWP further traction on the ground? And if you're thinking in terms of challenges, how might those be addressed? And I think we have heard quite a bit about language, but there are other things around ways of working and what is feasible or not, and how we can act as facilitators and enablers and all of that. So over to, let's see, I will pick on Laure Hélène.
Great. Thank you, Alina, for doing that. I was looking at my list of pre-prepared points, and actually most of them have come up during the conversation. So I would think for me the hardest are these organizational barriers. And I'm going to limit this to the donor agencies because that's what I'm mostly working on. You know, the great achievements of people on this call in pushing the boundaries and issuing guidance and changing some of the rules. At the end of the day, the procurement department, the contracting department, the senior manager just wants the money out of the door, whether it's a loan from the World Bank or money being dispersed from grants. And until we get those things addressed, we're going to be stuck in the way programs are able to operate by relying mostly on individuals within programs who know how to play around the rules or having really good partnerships or having enlightened leaders. So that's a fundamental barrier. And in this day and age where the aid environment is becoming rightly, in my view, less influential, but constrained by many broader factors such as climate change, war, and other conflicts, it's becoming harder to see what the solution would be. But I think for me, that's the cutting edge issue to keep thinking about and not just giving up on. Another point, which might be an easier win, and I'm talking here to Heather and others who work within those merged organizations. So it could be DFAT, which has development diplomacy together, or in Canada or in the UK. How do you get diplomats to pick some of the good aspects of this agenda, which is looking at longer term factors, looking at things from the point of view of the country you work in, not just from the point of view of the country you're representing, and getting diplomats to share some of their political skills with others, because diplomats are great at a lot of this agenda, but part of it they don't really get yet, or they need to realize how they actually can make use of those insights or can work with colleagues differently. So I would say, to my mind, these are some of the current challenges that I would like to have everyone's help on this call to address. Back to you, Alina.
Great, thank you so much. Verena, do you want to come in on that? Challenge or opportunity, or both?
Thank you. So I think, we all know, right, there is and I think across the development agency world, there is a pressure to disperse, right, to get money out, whether it's loans or whether it's grants, it doesn't really matter. But I think that's why I wanted to really raise and focus a bit on the climate change aspects. I think when it really comes to climate change, we are beginning to see some mind shift around that, because unless we get results, there is this sense that it's a waste. The amount of funding that we have relative to the scale of issues we have to tackle and the importance globally of tackling these issues make the effectiveness of the actions really, really critical. And that's why I think anything that's related to the climate change agenda does bring in a renewed and a greater urgency of taking political economy obstacles and challenges seriously. And so that, I think, will be quite an important space to focus on and to kind of give our best effort to. And so I think that's really one where it's critical. And the other might be around issues of fragility, because there is this trend of some deterioration, really, instability in a number of countries, but it's in some ways the hardest to get traction, right? The best political economy analysis cannot hold back fragility in Yemen or in Lebanon or in a number of other countries. We can point out why it's there and what entrenches it. Maybe just one quick last point is, while we have to understand failure and what not to do, we also have to understand success. So sometimes we keep thinking, well, there's so many obstacles to expanding renewables in this country. But yet, as the prices fall, as countries see what others are doing, we do see an expansion in quite a few countries, and sometimes in surprising places. So that learning about things that have happened despite some odds that are somewhat counterintuitive, that can really help us take some lessons from those places and bring them to others. So part of going into action is also about seeing where success has happened and then seeing how we can enable and facilitate that. And there we connect more also to some of the other agendas, PDIA, something we are calling Governable here in the World Bank, to see, you know, the change management and while taking the political constraints and opportunities seriously. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Verena. Heather, I think, no, you already spoke.
I mean, I could just respond to Laure Hélène's specific point, but I want to give space to others as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, because we have such an august audience among us today, I don't want to put any pressure on anybody, but I know that we have some other veterans who are not sitting in specifically in the round table with us, but I see lots of familiar names and some faces, and it would be really great to sort of see if people like maybe David Booth want to come in, Diana, all of our friends at USAID, etc. So Rachel as well, who has worked closely with Verena. So if you want to sort of provide some comments or reflections on what you're hearing, that would be very welcome. I also see someone Yas Gill, who's asking, can I ask a question based on an organizational analysis perspective? Yes, absolutely. So why don't you go for that?
Who is the you? Is it Jazz Gill or is it me?
Yes, Gill.
Right, yeah, right. Okay, right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can't
Okay.
see you, but we can hear you. If you
Well,
can let us
except-
know where you're, which
Right.
organization you're coming from, that'd be
Okay.
great.
It says you've stopped my video, but that doesn't matter. I'm an academic. I mean, I've sort of worked in. Oh, right. Thank you. All right. Okay. I mean, I've worked in different universities, but what I found very interesting is I'm an organizational design, organizational analysis person, and the kinds of things you're saying to me ring a lot of bells in from a number of disciplines. And I suppose in the work we do in organizational analysis, it is multidisciplinary, so we cover a wide range. So it's very interesting. I mean, you talked about this issue of DNA, and I think, okay, DNA, well, what is it? It takes multiple forms. Is it structures and rules? In institutional theory, we talk about agency and we talk about people. And so if you look at the work of Pash and Santos 2010, they talk about DNA as people with certain values and beliefs and interests moving into organizations or being placed into organizations in order to ensure certain kinds of organization, certain organizational change takes place or certain policies are accepted. And Pash and Santos is very, 2010 is very interesting, because what they're saying is, why does an organization move in a particular direction, which I think is partly what you're looking at, and what happens to an organization when it's under competing demands. And the focus there is on legitimacy. Legitimacy is different for different types of organizations. I mean, organizational analysis, we talk about four, but just taking it broadly. So if you've got different competing groups, let's say those that want climate adaptation or climate change or response to particular groups, and others which are don't favor that and are acting against it, both are seen as legitimate. The question is which directions the organization move in. And what Pash and Santos say is that what you've got to look is inside that organization and to see to what extent those ideas externally are represented internally in terms of a minority, majority, or is missing. And whichever group is in the majority with those ideas from outside, that's the direction that organization moves into. Okay, so that's one issue. Just a couple of others, if that's okay. I mean, the work we've tended to do is going into organizations, trying to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, And often we have no idea what to expect, which makes it very difficult to know which questions to ask. But a while ago, we looked at in healthcare, we looked at a privately run and a publicly run hospital, and we looked at the drivers which were leading to particular performance outcomes. And some of the things that I've already heard fit in very well with that. But what we found is we found about 30 drivers. There are more, but we were expecting 2 or 3, so 30 was quite a lot. And we categorize them, and this may resonate with some of the things that you've been talking about. What we found is that the drivers you could categorize into groups such as culture and norms, the organization design itself, technically, the ownership, the incentive systems, both internally and externally, the goals of the owners or stakeholders, as you may say, the goals of the clients and the dependence on that. So there's a whole lot of work, and I think research which could be brought into the PEA frameworks. And then you've got all the work on frameworks, framing. Most of the work's been done on social movements and so on. There's other work which shows that, ironically, when you're talking about legitimacy, you can actually gain legitimacy by acting illegitimately. Okay, that's paradoxically, by appearing to be illegitimate, you gain legitimacy. And finally, there's work on institutional logics, which talks about, the framework talk about 6, but there's many others. And so each type of organization has a particular institutional logic in terms of rules, behaviors, goals, structures, and so on. And I think that maybe looking at PEA from a broader perspective would be quite interesting and useful, rather than, because I think you're doing excellent work, but I would say, and it would be interesting to for example,
yes, let me please, thank you so much for your comments. That it's very wonderful that you have been able to join us and share that with us. Heather was asking if there's something that you can share in the chat in terms of something that might be useful to read. I just want to ensure that we have time to bring others to the conversation as well.
I'll put in some references.
That is great. Thank you so much. I see also in the chat that we have had some comments from Rachel. I don't know if you want to verbalize those, but also from Stephanie at USAID. If there's some things that you want to sort of perhaps share, if people are intrigued by what you may be sharing in the chat.
Alina, I can come in and just make the brief contribution. I just wanted to second Verena's point, as I said in the chat, about looking at the political economy of success and successful reforms. And I say that from the perspective that, on the one hand, I think it's a very interesting and important research question, right? That, I think we sometimes get labeled as being the researchers who look at the sort of dismal science of what is impossible, right? We understand why things aren't working. So I think it's an interesting research question. But it also, I think, as a tactic, is extremely helpful for our colleagues, both in terms of giving them something concrete to look at, as well as for the bureaucratic incentives that we face. So just as an example, it's much easier to publish a case study of how successful reforms happened in a particular context and to tell the political economy storyline of success than it is to publish a note on sort of the elite bargain, the capture dynamics, the challenges. So just as a tactic, it's extremely useful as well. So that's all from my side, and thanks for the opportunity to come in.
Thank you so much. I think that we have 2 people who have raised their hands, and I don't know how I can tell who it is. I see Clay and Sarah. All right. Clay, can you let us know also who you are, maybe? And then Sarah Swift come in as well. Thank you.
Yes, Clay Westcott. I'm a consultant and work for the World Bank and other agencies. I just wanted to, it's partly a comment, partly a question. And I think good governance, meaning rule of law and decent regulatory quality and so forth, is a very recent phenomenon historically. Came about as a side effect of state building in 19th century Europe and its offshoots. Bad governance has been much more common historically, where you have formal and informal rules and norms and practices that serve the self-interests of political leaders. Now, some analysts feel that the good governance era may be coming to an end. We have challenges like climate change and AI, which are just going to be too much for good governments to handle. And if we start to see that happening, even in high income countries, it's going to influence what it means to be thinking politically. For example, in the aid world, we need to think about backsliding in donor countries and thinking politically about donor countries as well as recipients. And I wonder if any of our panelists have thought about that.
Thank you so much, Clay. Sarah, can I move over to you, please?
Hi, I just kind of wanted to expand a little on, or just kind of reiterate what I put in the chat. I'm not sure if I still showed up as Stephanie at the time.
Yes, you did, I think.
I guess so. And also, you know, on Rachel's point about sort of demonstrating cases for success. And I think really looking at sort of the political economy that begins within our institutions and the stresses that are on different staff in order to recognize, you know, in order to be called out and the fears of failure and kind of the way that that acts upon people. And the fact that the consequences institutionally for failing in new and unusual ways can be much greater than failing in the ways that all have done before. And so really kind of trying to sort of build the safety around experimentation so that if you do fail, you're failing in good company as opposed to kind of being isolated within that. And then, yeah, like sort of, and then within that sort of trying to take those anxieties and think about how that translates into incentives for trying new things, whether people have been trying things that are very familiar for too long and are, you know, and are feeling both intrinsic or extrinsic pressure to do different things, or looking at when they're feeling stresses to look at different kinds of goals and broader, more sustainability aspects of things. So anyway, just kind of lots of interesting ideas from the internal bureaucratic side, and I'm grateful to all of you for bringing this up.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks everybody for the questions that they asked. I think, Clay, to your point, part of doing political economy analysis is precisely also to understand the political economy analysis, not only of countries in which one is working, but countries in which one, from which one might be getting funding. So all of that is really important. I think just to emphasize, though, the point of political economy analysis and thinking working politically is to try to move away from thinking in binary terms around good and bad governance, but really to sort of understanding this as much more nuanced processes between citizens and states that may work for certain purposes and not for others, and therefore really getting to the core of what the incentives are of why certain patterns of behavior recreate themselves over time and what have you. So with that, let me ask, by way of closing, I wanted to ask Heather, Laure Hélène, and Verena, but also I will do an experiment with the audience. So Heather, Laure Hélène, and Verena, if you can please, in 1 minute each, share something from the conversation today that has really struck you, or that has that will stay with you, or yes, or an insight that you have appreciated. And if I can ask all of you in the chat with the chat function, if you can do the same in writing, one thing that has struck you that will stay with you, an eureka moment that you may have had, that would be great. Heather, over to you.
I mean, I think I was just reflecting on Laure Hélène's question about diplomats, and really, you know, why would we expect diplomats to work the way that we might as development people if that's literally not their job, sort of thing. And that, to me, links to Stephanie's comment in the chat about, you know, frustrations, anxieties, exhaustion of people as well. And I think that is one of the things for me that we've long talked about sort of thinking about, turning TWP and PEA on ourselves and really continuing to appreciate the realities of the ways in which colleagues work and counterparts and so on, and aligning much more with how others see and work and need and what they need from us as well, I think is really important. And so Stephanie, certainly that's something I definitely relate to what you say here, and will continue to think about.
Great, thank you so much. Verena, over to you.
Thank you. I think, for me, as I think said at some point, within the World Bank, you can become a little insular in your big island. And it's always very good for me to, open up and look at the wider world and how political economy analysis and thinking and working politically is taking shape in other organizations. So I think that's always for me a great kind of learning and touching base opportunity that I find really, really important to also bring some of that energy and insights and resonation, or how it resonates elsewhere, to bring that back into our work here. So I'm really happy to have had this panel and the discussions today.
Great. Laure Hélène?
I think this has reinforced the way I opened this conversation around the optimism, the glass half full, because we've just had the richness of experiences. And I think similar experiences from Verena, Heather, and myself, and we don't work on the similar projects, about working with counterparts, trying to help them unblock their problems, adapting to their language, to their needs. I think this is really the way the debate seems to have shifted and the practice seems to have shifted, which is in the right direction. So yeah, so I'm coming out of this more energized than I was this morning. So it's great.
Fantastic, and thanks everybody who's taken me up on the on chatting sharing with us your thoughts from today in writing. That is really wonderful. It was really, really, really lovely to see so many of you and hear some of your voices as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to Alina and Catherine for organizing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.